So I'm going to talk about some of the different literary lenses that we will be looking at in this class. Some of these are harder than others, and we start off with the one that students typically dislike the most, and that's formalism. Sometimes this is also called new criticism. And formalism is a lens that really emphasizes close reading, so really looking at things like annotation, figurative language is a big one here, just really looking at the text and the text itself. And so you're not bringing in any outside information when you're analyzing using formalism. So you're not going to look at the author's background, you're not going to look at the history or anything like that. You're just going to look at the story and the text itself. This is really good for poetry, but I don't typically like to use it with high school students on bigger pieces of literature, though some students find that they do enjoy it. So some example questions we could use here are, how does the fairy tale structure affect our interpretation of stories like Cinderella and Snow White? So the fairy tale structure is, once upon a time, the story happens and it ends with the wedding of the princess and they all lived happily ever after. So how does that story structure affect how we're going to think of and view stories like Cinderella and Snow White? Another one is we always look at things like metaphors and symbolism. So what does the glass slipper symbolize in Cinderella? This could be a paper you could write on. This would be something like the glass slipper represents freedom for her, and that's why she needs the slipper to escape her home, stuff like that. Another one is what would be the significance of the phrase, and they lived happily ever after. You could break down what that would mean to people, what it means for the story, that kind of thing. Now, when I talk about lens questions, I want you to realize I'm not asking you to answer them right away. We're just trying to come to a place where we could think about these things. Next lens is new historicism. A new historicism just focuses on how history is represented in a book or a text of some kind, and how history will influence the meaning of that text. So a good example I use for this is the Odyssey. Over here you can see that I've got my face covering it, but the Odyssey, if we view the Odyssey through the lens of this was ancient Greece, it reflects the values of that time, and it's not reflecting the values of our time, we can better understand the story and its significance. Example questions here I have most of the common Western fairy tales. When I say Western, I mean European and American, were written before 1800. What can we learn about the cultures of those times from the story? So is there something about the 1800s that we see reflected in stories like Cinderella and Snow White? Similarly, most fairy tales end with a wedding. What does this tell us about the values of the periods wherein fairy tales were written? So we can tell probably that people really valued weddings and marriage during these time periods because almost every single story ends with a wedding or a marriage. Last one here is I ask, when fairy tales are adapted into movies, how do we change them? And what does that say about our culture today in comparison to their culture? So for example, a lot of old Grimm's fairy tales are very dark and they end with lots of death, and they're just very much not what Disney would typically do. But when Disney adapts these stories, they change a lot of things. So what are the differences in cultural values between these two time periods? That's new historicism. Third, we have feminist criticism. And feminist criticism is really just focused on how the text discusses women, patriarchal societies, which are societies led or ruled by men, and how the text discusses male-female relationships. So is there relationships where the man is in power and the woman is not, or relationships where the woman hates the man? What's the relationship there? Example questions I use here are, how are Snow White's actions shaped by the patriarchal society in which she lives? So an example of this is, Snow White is a princess, and yet she is forced to work for 7 men who are technically below her social standing. What does that mean for her as a woman? Another one is, how is Ariel's voice being lost symbolic of women's fight for a voice in modern culture and society? And so that one you can blend it a little bit into formalism because of the symbolism, but because we're bringing the concept of feminism in here and today's society, it's not formalism, it's feminist lens. Last one, why is it necessary for Mulan to give up her femininity to become a hero? Why couldn't she remain feminine and be the hero at the same time? And what does that say about her society and ours, and that we enjoy this story and we depict it in children's videos?